Hey everyone, it's been over 2 minutes and I haven't been raped yet. And neither was Mandi Gray. Hi, I'm Diana Davison, and last week I was talking about the rambling, incoherent judgment of Marvin Zuker, an Ontario judge who convicted Mustafa Ururyar of sexually assaulting Mandi Gray. An appeal of Judge Zuker's decisions, including his revoking Mr. Ururyar's bail, was successful based on Superior Court finding that the decision was jaw-dropping and agreeing that there was a reasonable apprehension of bias from the judge. The original decision was hailed as a victory for feminism. CBC wrote, "Judgment in Mandi Gray's sexual assault case glorious, but change to legal system will be slow." This is what the advocates are saying. And it doesn't mean we've won the war, but it is important, legal expert says of judgment. From that article, one of the advocates noted the judge's references to academic and grassroots research that has been done on sexual violence over the last several decades, and that he took time to explore the issues of consent and reasonable doubt. He is assessing and analyzing the law correctly, which is what we want judges to do all the time. The decision is moving, it's empowering, it creates a little bit of hope in a situation where I think a lot of us had been feeling that there wasn't any hope in terms of the criminal law being able to be helpful in a case of sexual assault. In addition, the article states, prosecutors can now have Zuker's judgment on hand when a complainant comes to their office, she said, and point to it as an example of a positive outcome. It's a tremendous tool for lawyers in their decision-making process as they proceed, but also it will provide an example to complainants, to witnesses, on why this is a worthwhile process. This will only get better if these cases repeatedly come to the court so the judicial minds can figure it out. Change will also come to the legal system if judges look at this judgment and start to rely on it, she said. All right, so we're talking about a judgment that was extremely rare, in a bad way. The Supreme Court saw it as a rare and unusual case which required overturning. From the National Post, York PhD student gets bail pending appeal of high-profile sexual assault conviction. Get a little rundown of how this went down. On July 21st, Mustafa Ururyar was found guilty of sexually assaulting Mandi Gray. 4 days later, Judge Zuker revoked his bail ahead of the September 14th sentencing. Ururyar pleaded not guilty in the judge-only trial and testified that the sex was consensual. On July 26th, so 5 days later, Ururyar's defense team filed an appeal on the grounds that Zuker displayed a reasonable apprehension of bias in favor of the victim during the trial. The defense also made a rare pre-sentence application for Ururyar's release pending appeal, arguing that he met all the conditions for bail. So this was kind of an odd thing to be going into an appeal before the sentencing, and it required extreme circumstances. They had to make this case to Superior Court Justice Michael Quigley. Zuker's ruling, which railed against rape myths and excoriated Ururyar, was hailed by advocates pushing for reforms to how the justice system handles sexual assault cases. But the defense has now successfully used it to secure bail for Ururyar until his appeal can be heard about 6 to 8 months from now. He'll have to surrender himself to a Toronto jail the day before he's sentenced, but he'll likely be a free man again after the September 14th hearing, no matter what the outcome. This is kind of interesting. Even after sentencing, he probably won't be in jail again. In considering whether he should grant Ururyar bail, Justice Quigley had to assess the strength of the appeal, which will not be heard in court for at least 6 months. Even the Crown conceded that Ururyar has grounds for appeal, although it disagreed with the defense's statement that they were strong grounds. It certainly shocked me, I will say, that Justice Zuker felt fit to include all of the academic references he did and didn't see fit to tell counsel. That's a jaw-dropper in my view, Quigley said, adding he was concerned that Zuker had a predisposed mind that may be a little too full with opinions on battered woman syndrome and memory fragmentation in victims of sexual abuse. So, Mandi Gray's lawyer, David Butt, has for a number of years been involved and increasingly vocal about his suggestion of a new hybrid type of court system that deals only with sexual assaults. So, from this article in the Montreal Gazette, Toronto-based criminal lawyer David Butt, who often represents sexual assault victims, has argued persuasively for another option, giving the Crown the option to pursue a case as a civil suit. The immense advantage of a civil lawsuit is no proof beyond a reasonable doubt, only the lower standard of balance of probabilities, Butt wrote in the Globe and Mail last year, which means proving to just a 51% likelihood that the assault occurred. This is an interesting idea of how to determine whether or not somebody committed a serious crime. Most people think that rape is a very serious crime, and he wants to put it in civil court instead. Which, for those who might support this idea, remember that success in a civil court doesn't actually bar them from taking you to criminal court afterwards. David Butt spells out his idea a little bit in more detail in the Toronto Star. He says, allow Crowns to handle some cases civilly. In a certain class of cases, sexual assault victims are looking for jail. In a certain class of cases, dangerous predators and so on, the public is looking for jail too. For that class of cases, you have to stick with the criminal justice system, says criminal lawyer David Butt, who often represents sexual assault victims. But in cases where victims are looking for recognition that they were wronged, or to hold the perpetrator accountable, Crowns should have the option to proceed in civil court, he argues. This would apply particularly to cases where judges say it might have happened, it probably happened, but I don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, Butt says. Civil cases are held to a lower standard of proof than criminal courts, a balance of probabilities rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The flip side of this, because he recognizes that, lowering the burden of proof on somebody who's accused is a bad thing, but he says the flip side is that cases handled in the civil system don't lead to convictions, jail time, and criminal records. So really just the accused only has to pay money. And, if you're falsely accused, would you rather risk going to jail or just having to pay money? But this doesn't go quite far enough for Ms. Mandi Gray. In a public statement for media, she says, I demand that the role of the police in sexual assault be seriously reconsidered and eventually abolished. Right? So no more police to, I don't know what sort of place you'd go to lay your charges or to make your complaint, but it shouldn't be the police, according to her. And I'm assuming this is because she also doesn't think that they should do an investigation before deciding to lay charges. Good idea, Mandi. What a bizarre, brave new world you and your lawyer are coming up with. So let's start with whether or not Mustafa Ururyar should have been in court at all. Mandi tells us, immediately after the video statement, he, the police officer, called me a week after I did the statement on a Friday night when the charges were still pending, and he told me the Crown attorneys weren't sure if charges were going to be laid because they said I implied my consent. And I challenged him and said that's actually not a legal defense. And then he hung up the phone and he said he would get back to me. And then he emailed me and said that charges had in fact been laid, and that was my experience with the Toronto police in reporting. So charges were laid because Mandi knew she could force police to lay charges. She claims she was told that police considered her alcohol intake to have implied consent, but it's more likely that they had trouble with one of her text messages that she sent to her friend, which read, I don't know what it is. I didn't consent, but I didn't not consent. Now, advocates would say that this still isn't a good reason to not lay charges, but that's because they believe we should have a court system that doesn't involve police, doesn't allow anything the accuser says or does affect her credibility, that there should be a lower burden of proof for conviction, and that judges like Marvin Zuker, who delivered a jaw-droppingly bad decision, should be the type of judge presiding over these no-evidence trials. So, given that Zuker didn't actually assess credibility, I'm going to go through some of my favorite moments from the trial and let you make your own decision. In the same sequence of text messages where Mandi says she didn't not consent, she says this about how she and Mustafa ended up in the pub together. It just happened we were at the same bar. An uncontested fact in the trial is that Mandi actually enticed Mustafa, who wasn't feeling well that night, by texting him this message. I'm at Victory, come drink and then we can have hot sex. So Mandi is lying about how Mustafa ended up at the pub, and you have to wonder what else is she lying about. This sequence of messages was sent after a trip home on the TTC, took about 45 minutes, during which Mandi admits she was quite angry, and she had lots of time to create a revenge plot, starting with the setup, this series of messages. It's an obvious lie that Mustafa just happened to be at the bar. The only reason she would say that is to distance herself from her own actions and choices. Mustafa says that Mandi was touching him sexually while they were at the pubs, and that he had to ask her to stop twice. He doesn't like public displays of a sexual nature around work colleagues. Mandi, at one point, tells the court. And then I remember we were at a different table, and I remember him, asking me not to, touch him in public, which was kind of off-putting and surprising. Not that I was, hurt, but before, it wasn't an issue if his girlfriend knew about this. So Mandi acknowledges that he said this. Her statement that she was off-put and confused because it hadn't been a big deal before implies that she had touched him, but she revisits this episode later on with the following statements. Yeah, that's a good one in terms of him telling me, don't touch me, for example, which was never a conversation. It was not in relation to me. I hadn't touched him. I hadn't groped him at the bar, as you had suggested yesterday. It kind of came out of the blue. Don't touch me. Oddly, she then says, that is one example of his kind of mentality in terms of his entitlement to me and other women. Well, that doesn't really follow. She's just kind of going off on some ideological rant there. In terms of credibility, it does not make sense that Mustafa would say something for no reason at all. Mandi actually claims they spent almost no time together at the first bar, which makes it even more unlikely that he would have made that comment out of the blue. And her claim that they spent almost no time together also doesn't make sense because before he arrived, she texted Mustafa that she was going to leave. She wasn't having fun. It's so boring here. You're not missing anything. That's around 8:18. And Mustafa responds, oh, why? She says, weird vibe. I think I'll go home soon, LOL. And then he says, I'm going to come in a bit. Followed by her saying, oh, miss me that much? Just kidding. So Mustafa says that he sat next to Mandi almost the entire hour that they were at the first bar. Mandi says they hardly interacted at all. If Mustafa's arrival hadn't changed her experience of the bar, it's unlikely she would have carried on to the next bar. Credibility goes in favor of Mustafa on both counts. Mandi did touch him, and they spent enough time together to convince her that the night wasn't boring anymore. Now, remember that text where Mandi invites Mustafa out offering hot sex? She later confirms his story that he didn't want to have sex, but says that that statement was as weird as his don't touch me statement. So I could sleep over, but he wouldn't have sex with me, which I thought was a totally weird thing to say. But I kind of just wanted somewhere safe to sleep, so I said, okay. Keep in mind, this exchange happened before they left the first bar. The night was still young, and she decided to not leave with a bunch of her friends who didn't go to the second bar. So she wasn't that drunk yet, and it wasn't that late, only 10 o'clock. And she didn't actually need a safe space. Now, I'm going to skip over the rape allegation that happens when they make it back to Mustafa's place, because most of Mandi's story is that she doesn't remember much of anything because she was really drunk. I'll make a brief comment at the end. For now, I'm going to go to the next morning. Mandi says that when she woke up, sober, Mustafa was masturbating next to her and he tried to push her head down to give him a blowjob. When asked how this went down, question, well, how was Mr. Ururyar positioned? Was he sitting, standing, lying down? She says he was laying in his bed. Okay, and were the covers on, no covers on? I don't remember. Could you see his penis? Yes. And so, were there no covers on, or did you have the covers over your head? Mandi says, I guess there would have been no covers then. Okay, so she figures out that there were no covers in her story because she's committed herself already to saying that she could see his genitals. Then, when asked later if his pants were on or off at this point, do you know if Mr. Ururyar's pants were completely off or if they were still up? Her answer, he wasn't wearing pants because I remember seeing them on the floor when I left. Right. So she knew his pants weren't on because they were on the floor. Not because the covers were off and she could see his penis, but because she remembers them lying on the floor. Let me tell you what this answer is consistent with. It's consistent with Mustafa's version of events. He says he woke up and Mandi was standing at the end of the bed, dressed, with her parka on, and she was glaring at him. And then she left. If that was true, it would make a lot more sense that Mandi only knew his pants were off because she saw them on the floor. Mustafa says that Mandi is lying because she was angry he broke up with her and still had sex with her anyways. Mandi confirms that he broke up with her and didn't want to sleep with her again when she says, "Sorry, I'm just trying to process this question. After that night, I don't know in terms of breaking up. Like, it wasn't a conversation. Like, he made it very clear that he wanted nothing to do with me. And, like, to be quite honest, it's like, why would I want somebody in my life that treated me that way either?" And yet she also said that she wasn't acting vindictively due to rejection. She's asked, "Mr. Ururyar told you, my girlfriend is coming and so this relationship is finished, right?" She says, "That's not exactly what he said." Question, "Well, what did he say?" Answer, "He said it could continue as a secret." Of course, the defense lawyer responds, "I'm going to suggest to you that that's not what he said. He broke up with you and you began to cry." In terms of credibility, I can't mesh those two statements together. He said he wanted nothing to do with me, and then he says he wants to carry on in secret. The second idea, that Mustafa was saying all of these mean things, but then also asking her to keep on seeing him on the side, makes no sense at all. Mandi insists he said, "This is the last time I'm going to fuck you and you're going to like it." That's a big part of her story. But now she's also telling us that he wanted to keep sleeping with her in secret. Mandi, you can't just say shit. It has to make sense. This was, in fact, the last time that you were going to have sex with him, and your statement about secrets is a lie, according to your own evidence. One more little thing, because it was used to create evidence in her case. Mandi took a Plan B birth control pill when she went to the hospital for a rape kit to be done. She did this to bolster her claim that she was afraid and had not consented. She says in the trial, again, do you know whether he ejaculated that time? She says, "I don't know." "Do you know whether he was wearing a condom?" She says, "He wasn't. He refused to wear condoms." But, as it turns out, it was actually her that had told him that he didn't need to use a condom. Question, and the reason you had no concern with Mr. Ururyar not using a condom is because you had told him you were keeping track of your cycle, correct? She answers, "I do that, yes." Question, and you had told Mr. Ururyar that, correct? Answer, assuming that is how you know it, I keep track of my periods, yes. Okay, and that's why you had no issue when Mr. Ururyar didn't use a condom, correct? And she says, "That's incorrect, because I was fertile. I took Plan B, so that's actually false." Now, her taking Plan B doesn't actually make it false that was their arrangement. In terms of their communication over this, they had an arrangement that Mandi was in charge of birth control and that she would only have sex with him if it was in a safe part of her cycle. And we know that she told him earlier that evening that she was ready that night for hot sex. Mustafa's version of the story is that Mandi got on top of him and gave him a blowjob after he said he didn't want to have sex with her. This changed his mind, and she then got on her hands and knees, doggy style. He ejaculated onto her back. I believe Mustafa's version of events. I'm glad he didn't trust Mandi completely with the birth control, and she most certainly did not need to take Plan B. I believe Mustafa's version of events because not only does he remember how all the sexual acts took place, his story isn't full of contradictions. In fact, the only gaping hole I could find in Mustafa's story was Mandi Gray.